Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our latest AMA edition entitled From Chaos to Cohesion, Designing a Smarter Stack. My name is Mike Almeida. I'm your co-host. I'm joined along with my friend and business partner, Marc Gibson. And we've got a treat for you today in terms of content. And really what we decided conversation should go about is ultimately technology, which shouldn't surprise you, but we're going to dive into a little bit more complexity of what has become something we view as very overwhelming in business today. And what we mean by that is it's becoming more and more chaotic to figure out what type of approach we should have when it comes to choosing technology. Right? There's always the latest and greatest gizmo, gadget, service, offering, and every one of those things seems to have their own environment of sorts on how to maintain the integrity, the cohesiveness, maintain its own environment. And so for us as business owners, there are several questions that come to mind. How do you get your arms around all of these different gadgets? How do you get your arms around how you connect to them, how your business connects to them? How do you use them? How do you understand the philosophy or the dynamics between securing those apps, protecting them? How many is too many? Is there a way for us to simplify that approach? And so that leads me to the kickoff question for you, Mark, for today's topic really is how or what is the best way for me as a business owner to simplify my tech stack?
So the short but not too helpful answer is whatever best way supports your business, right? So the old consultant answer of it depends. But if we try to put that in some terms or in a lens that's a little bit more helpful, it's really that when you start to make choices around how you build out your tech stack, whether that's individually or a holistic design, which hopefully you're considering how they go together, it's really you got to be thinking about your governing principles really got to be productivity, security, and simplicity. That's kind of the three things you want to keep in mind as you're building that out. And so as you kind of consider those two approaches, the two paths there, really one is about cohesion, which is how do all of these things sort of fit together, versus the idea of best of breed or best in class. Like, hey, I'm evaluating each application or tool on its own. I want the best of whatever that particular function is, and I want to be able to have a collection of those. And so those, you don't have to really choose explicitly between those two, but that's generally where you're going to fall, because at the end of the day, if you are not, you're going to lean towards best of breed almost instinctively. That's how most people approach it, and it takes a little bit of discipline and intentional structure to achieve the cohesive piece. So you're making a choice one way or the other, largely just kind of how you fall. So, but when you think about making a choice between best of breed really is, like I said, the idea of how does one function, or how does one person or a small group of people, how do they function best? Maybe with what they're familiar with, or their specific set of activities or requirements that they need, and we want a tool that fits those requirements exclusively the best. Versus the sort of the broader approach, which is the idea of how do those systems, how will they interact with our existing tools, our existing workflows, the entire team? How do we make sure that it's blended with that group of people, plus our business goals as well? Not always, when you are looking at best of breed, is the business goal included. It's really more a little bit more myopic focus on that. So that's really sort of the two approaches that you're looking at when you talk about tech stack.
Sure. And now when we look at the broader picture of, gosh, there's so many applications that exist today. You can just pull up your phone and go to the App Store, and you're inundated with that. Why do you believe we've become so focused on applications, particularly in our business?
I don't necessarily think we've become application focused. I think we kind of always are. Like users in general are typically, or individuals really, are focused on kind of what's in what's in their view, right? And so uh, when you start to look at it more from a system perspective, you generally have a broader approach to all of this, and so that's the lens through, one side of that's sort of application centric, which is I need to accomplish this particular activity, this particular function, whatever I need to do to get that done. I can push my data to that application, which today, and this is where a lot of this has become a little bit more relevant, usually means that you're working with an individual cloud for each application, right? And so what that becomes then is its own little area that has its own data, its own users and identities, its own security, its own access. And then the challenge becomes the idea of how do we make those things work together? How do we secure them together? How do we, bring it together from a functionality perspective as well as a security? Looks like you might have lost me there for a second. So I was saying is the apps themselves, they're in their own little clouds and their own little fiefdoms, and it's about how do we bring them all together so that we can, govern and protect our users, our data, our devices, whatever, all in one place. And so looks like I'm having some network connectivity issues today. So, but anyway, that's what we're trying to, reconcile as we look at these tech stack choices is what's the impact on, this fragmented approach to where all of our data applications and usability live versus how do we make that a little bit more
I think about times when I've worked for companies and I've brought new people on board. It never fails that when new people come on site, they also have ideas and systems that they're comfortable with that they've used in the past. And so I've always experienced, at least I'm just speaking for myself, but technology is always a request. Like when they come and they work and say, hey, I need this to do this. I need this technology to do that. How do we handle that as business owners when we're bringing new people on and they immediately go for the jugular when it comes to a technology request?
I think it's probably reflective of where you are in your business journey. The more you sort of scale, mature, evolve, the more likely you are to have developed your own standard. Where there's not as much necessarily flexibility for individual choice, but that's part of the process, right? Which is, are we a collection of people or are we a team? And when you think about this, I always like sort of sports analogies, right? So the idea of when you're building a team, say a basketball team or whatever, is it a collection of all stars? Do you want the best player at every position, which generally doesn't work that well? Or your culture, your program, your style more. And so as trading, the network piece. But so as you're building out your tech stack, it's really like building out a team piece, which is the idea of, do I want the best application or do I want the best fit? And so if you've already established what that best fit for you because you've matured in your operations, then you're going to, have a little bit less flexibility for individuals to come in and sort of suggest or require certain technologies. If you, on the other hand, don't have those standards, or those standards aren't required because your business is, a little bit loose, then you're able to, allow that flexibility for the individuals. So that's sort of how you're looking at it and making that decision.
How is there any way you break it down? When you think of any aspects to consider as you're building this tech stack, are there any fundamentals that, if you had to group them into categories, how would you group them from a consideration perspective?
I mean, in terms of kind of how you're building out maybe requirements.
Yeah, because a lot of what I heard here was like functionality. Sounds like are there any other pieces that you would consider, or at least you should your IT team perhaps might consider this as you're building this out for yourself?
Yeah, I think of them usually in sort of three categories, really, which is, there's your functionality piece, which is, again, sort of the usability. What is the what are the people that are using it? What do they need? Then there's the security considerations. How do we secure those workflows? How do we secure the data, so forth? And then there's your administration piece of it, which is the idea of how easily can you make changes for the applications, for the devices, for the data, for the users, all of those things, the things that, a little bit more back end for your IT team. But those three things should really be kind of how you define your requirements and the considerations that you make.
Okay. So I think, again, as the title says, from chaos to cohesion, practically speaking, how do you solve this problem? Like what's the ultimate solution for someone who maybe recognizes they've got some chaos going on and they want to start getting to cohesion?
Well, I think, and this is maybe some key context, I think, and certainly in terms of how I think about it. Even when you ask the question about sort of between people versus system, is kind of understanding our current environment, right? Like 25 years ago, right? Technology sort of demanded that everything was in one place. Like we just had too many limitations. Like we were working from the office. That's where most everything took place. That's where your apps were. That's where your devices were. That's where your users were. And then over time, as technology has developed, we've chosen the flexibility that was offered to us. Users could get out into the world and be a bit more mobile. The cloud proliferation that's happened, we've been able to move our apps and data there. And so as everything kind of has moved to one place or another, it's been largely about flexibility. Functionality and security, or even convenience and security, are usually the two considerations about how you look at applications. But typically we assume that if flexibility goes up, so does functionality. That's not necessarily been true over the last decade or so, because there's been so much flexibility that the functionality has become, again, sort of fragmented, right? How do I get these applications to talk to each other? So how do I get app 1 to talk to app 2 to talk to app 3, which, by the way, also needs to be utilized by user 1 on device 1 and 2 for them to be able to generate a value and perform their functions. So that's all part of the design. And it was something that we've only had to consider over the last couple of decades because, again, it wasn't a flexible option that was offered to us. So, the answer to that, to me, like in terms of how you address it, is you have to start to look at how can you still provide that flexibility while also improving on the functionality and the security. And to me, I think it's not really so much about how do we make all of these things connect. It's more about how do we start to consolidate them back into a single place. So again, that used to be the office. In 2025, that's probably consolidated. So that's really what we're kind of talking about today, right? Is the idea that for us, we look at that strategically as Microsoft 365 is sort of the answer, to that, because from my experience, our discussions, our research, so forth, they're really the only game in town when it comes to having all of this, all of these features, functions, tools under one umbrella. Just about every other provider that you're going to look at, particularly when you take a best in breed or best of class approach to it, you're going to have to involve third parties to be able to achieve all of the things that you need.
Absolutely. So, Mark, kind of talking about this, I'll use the term ecosystem for lack of better terms, bringing everything under this one umbrella. What are some of the inherent benefits for business owners who may have had systems and features that are sort of disjointed? What's the main benefit, or maybe series of benefits? So what happens when you start to collaborate and bring them together in that single ecosystem?
So what you're looking at there is bringing under one umbrella is sort of that ease of use. It's a little bit easier to deploy solutions. It's a little bit easier to administer solutions, which usually makes it a little bit more cost effective. Not necessarily just from a price tag perspective, but also from training, familiarity, just total cost of ownership type scenario, which is the idea of being able to, have those connected without having to find third-party applications that can connect, to different, how do I connect my email with my CRM? How do I connect my CRM to, application 2 over here? Being able to move data around within your organization is much easier. It also comes with a lot less overhead in terms of your users trying to be able to figure out how to do that. So that's on the functionality side, right? Because we talked about there being two areas, sort of from a security and administration side. And from a security perspective, obviously, if the data and the applications and the people are all in one place, that's a lot easier to protect than if they are, strewn about the internet. The old, philosophy and image for, IT guys and security guys was castle and moat, right? That's how we used to think about the office, right? Well, physically speaking, that's kind of the image that we're talking about here. Is we're still looking to kind of get maybe back to the castle and moat, just the castle.
That's right.
Castle's not in the office, the castle's in the cloud. But we still want to have everything under that one set of boundaries where possible. Again, may not be something that you can do for 100% of your functions or 100% of your applications. But if that's your overarching thought process for your design, the things that are outside that boundary are going to be the exceptions and the one-offs. Today, it's really a little bit more that just about every small business I talk to, it's all over the place, right? Their data, their applications, and again, we've really encouraged most of our clients to pull that into one location and have been successful in a lot of those cases. But just finding somebody, talking to them, they don't have that approach in mind. Like I said, you're going to drift more towards a little bit of this chaos than you would to a single cohesive environment, unless you've got.
So speaking to that particular audience that you just said, someone who's got systems and data flowing all over the place in the ether, what are some actionable steps if there's a person out there watching this or watching the recording? What would you instruct them, or would you suggest that they do to start to combat this?
Well, I think the first question is, again, let's go back to what are the business goals? You may not be in a place where you feel that there's a need to combat it. I mean, that's the reality of the situation is more the idea that maybe you're comfortable with your security as is, maybe you're comfortable with your growth as is, like the flows that you have. You're not running into sort of walls, knocking your knees on any limitations. If that's true, I don't know, keep strong and carry on, type stuff. But if you are, I think the next question becomes having a conversation with your IT person. Now, the reason I say it that way is because you as a business owner are pretty much, I would say, not qualified to know if the technology is performing, or is causing a limitation for you on your growth or your development. But I would also tell you that your IT guy is also not qualified to know that in a vacuum, because this is where we're talking about bringing the business and the technology together. Business can't answer the technology by itself. Technology can't answer the business by itself. So we talk about the concept of IT cohesion a lot, and that's what we're talking about here is the idea of, is my business being limited by the technology choices that we've made up until now and how they operate? That's a collaborative conversation with your IT guy to really, come to a conclusion. We need to make a change or we don't.
Excellent points. Awesome. So we've got a list of questions here that are coming in, and I'll go through them one by one. I don't know if we'll have a chance to answer all of them, but we'll give it our best shot. So first question for you, Mark. When you look at a growing tech landscape, how do you decide whether to pursue a best in breed approach versus building a tightly integrated cohesive stack?
So it's, well, I think we kind of touched on this a little bit, right? The idea that I think you have those three principles that are sort of governing the approach, right? The productivity, security, and simplicity. If you look at that, and you're able to achieve a comfortable level of that, while also providing that additional flexibility that comes with the best of breed or the individual choices, I guess. And that's when I say flexibility, I'm talking about for your users to be able to simply, use the app of their choice. If that's not having an impact on those three principles, or at least not to a way that you're uncomfortable with them, then you should probably, continue with the best of breed so that you don't impact that. If you're not able to do it, again, and this is where I think most small businesses find themselves, is that if you have 10 different applications for 10 different users that do the same basic function, that's incredibly hard to develop any kind of efficiency, which has obviously an impact on profitability. It's also impossible to develop any kind of standards, which has impact on both that functionality and security. So that's the criteria I would use for determining how you take this approach is what's your impact on that productivity, security, and simplicity. If you're comfortable with it, continue on. If you're not, start to look at being able to consolidate.
That's really good feedback. All right, second question came in. Looks like, what practical steps can an organization take to map out every application it currently runs and identify any overlapping functionalities before deciding to keep, replace, or retire?
Well, so hopefully, and I, from experience, know that this is more of a hope than a reality. But you've got a list, you've got an inventory, right, of your applications and maybe even your devices and your tools, so that there's a reference point, even if it's not 100%, but you get a reference point that you can kind of look at and say, hey, here's all of our assets. Assuming you don't have that, you've got to take a little bit of work. IT guys hopefully going to lead that effort for you, and then work with you with your users to be able to understand kind of what each of these things are for. The real challenge when it comes to this kind of question / activity is it's not usually 5 applications that do the same one thing. It's usually that there's 4 or 5 things that those 5 applications do that they overlap with each other, and you're using this application for that one, you're using the second application for this one, and then so it's sort of fragmented, right? And you get to a place where it's really, you have to choose to do something a different way. So application 1 has to be consolidated with application 2, which also means you changing your process just a little bit. But those are things that you have to make choices on after you've got the full picture of your
good answer.
tech stack.
Okay, I really like this next question because I think this one really ties more into the business side of it. In moving from an app-centric mindset to a data-centric one, what are the biggest cultural or operational hurdles you've seen, and how can leaders help teams make that shift smoothly?
So the thing I would say, okay, so technology value comes from adoption, right? That's where you start to get your value from. The adoption comes from ease of use. The ease of use comes from the design, sort of how you're using things. But the design comes from the understanding. How's it being used? What are the workflows? What's the user experience? So on and so forth. I say all of that to kind of answer this question from a perspective of everybody's resistant to change, particularly when they're sort of familiar with certain things. And so from a cultural perspective, leadership has to lead on these changes. They have to be able to help people understand why they're making changes, why it's a positive to the business, why it's a positive to the individual. And if they're coming alongside their users as that happens, those things go pretty smoothly. If they're not, they don't. And frankly, even if they are with them, there's still bumps in the road, right? But if you're committed as an organization, then it's a lot easier to handle the cultural changes. So it's really about just helping them understand where the value comes from.
Very good. Here's the next question here. How does the choice between a single ecosystem like M365 and a collection of best of breed tools affect the overall security posture? Are there any hidden risk in either model?
So I don't think that. I think this is always a question of fit. So not necessarily right or wrong, better or best, but fit. You can achieve an appropriate level of security for through a Google-based system, through a Microsoft-based system, through Apple might be your focus, although that's a little less common. So that's not necessarily the point. Is to say, ooh, Microsoft is what provides the security, because security is never about the. Well, I won't say never about the tool, but security is mostly not about the tools. It's mostly about the behaviors. It's about the processes. It's about being able to reinforce those things as it goes along. So I don't know how hidden the risks are based on tool selection. I think the risks maybe are hidden based on the ambiguity or the lack of clarity that businesses have about themselves in terms of how they operate, how they use their data. That's the reason almost every IT project starts with a discovery of some sort. And it doesn't even have to be a project. It's any activity, because it is the businesses usually can't tell you what they're doing. You have to go find it out for themselves. So I think, going back to this is mostly about, Microsoft 365 offers you the opportunity to have all of those assets in one location, to make that more intuitive, to make that a little bit more native, to make it a little bit more, intuitive, I guess. But it does not mean that it's necessarily going to be the highest quality security. That's still the variable for that is still about the people and the processes of your organization. So it's something to definitely keep in mind.
All right, here's another really good question. You mentioned productivity, security, and simplicity as governing principles. Which of these tends to dominate the decision making in practice, and how do you keep the others from being sacrificed?
Okay, that's interesting. I think honestly, none of those dominate the conversation. Profitability just dominates the conversation. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, productivity is probably the most is probably the closest, to that profitability conversation. And it's certainly where most of the user population lives, right? Because that's what they're doing every day. So it comes up pretty often. When you're just talking about planning in general, security and simplicity, security is almost always a lagging, consideration. Simplicity comes up only as it begins to affect productivity. So how do you keep them from being left out? It's really kind of keeping the focus at the business goal level to say, hey, how do each of these choices affect the results or the outcomes that we're having? What's our overall goal in making this change or making this selection, and understanding how each of those map to that.
Good answer, Mark. I really like that one. That one is definitely a challenging one. Here's a kind of this question gives me a chuckle because I've seen this plenty of times. But given the mixed emotional response some users have toward the Microsoft brand, how do you address resistance and ensure adoption when migrating to a unified platform like M365?
I don't know. The way that question's sort of posed, it feels like it's coming as like a user question, I think, a little bit. And in that regard, it's not really any different than any other change criteria, I guess we'll say. Probably the more prominent place is when we're talking about the decisions to begin with, right? When we say, hey, consolidating on a Microsoft platform, or even using a Microsoft product. I mean, certainly Microsoft's been a dominant player for a very long time. It's grown with the times, and along the way, as with any product that is so dominant, it attracts any number of people who are like, nope, not for me. And so if that's an emotional based response, not much I can do with that. If it's a fact-based, feature-based, process-based response, then we can evaluate it. And, at the end of the day, this is where you're having the conversation about how you choose. I mean, inherently, right? Cohesive versus best of breed. As we talked before, there's really only the one player who can provide you the cohesive structure at the levels we're talking about over Microsoft side. So if you have this emotional response as a leader that says, hey, I don't want to use Microsoft, or we're not comfortable with it, no problem at all. But at that point, you are in a best of breed tech stack build by default. And so at that point, you're just choosing based on features and trying to make it fit as best you can. Again, it's not like you can't do any cohesion, right? If you're outside of Microsoft, there are ways to do that. It's just a little bit more complicated. There's more moving parts. That's all.
Yep. All right. And I'm going to sneak one last question in here. I think this is a good one. Is there a quantitative benchmark, like number of apps per employee, any integration points or support tickets, that tells an organization it's crossed the line into an unmanageable app stack?
Quantitative benchmark. Most likely no. Because if you're in a place where we're really trying to, move from chaos to cohesion, as we talked about here, almost by definition, if you're at that level of chaos, you're not measuring anything or you're not measuring well enough. So there's no quantitative data that's available to you to say, oh, we should make this shift. Probably the criteria though that comes up the most often that brings this home is the idea of it's frustration level. It's emotional pain for maybe it's a single business owner or a collection of leaders where they just have a gut feel that they can't quite keep their arms around everything that's happening, or they know that stuff takes longer than it should, or maybe than it could if it was a little bit simpler. Maybe there's some sort of an event that happens, whether that's a failure in the production environment, or it's some type of security event, whatever. It's usually always going to be some type of either standalone or qualitative measure, not a quantitative one.
Excellent. Oh, good point. Well, Mark, appreciate you going that extra mile there at the end. To our viewers, thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to get more content throughout the month, you can follow us on LinkedIn or like and subscribe on our YouTube channel, where you'll get up-to-date information as we go along. So thanks again, Mark. Appreciate your time today, and you guys enjoy the rest of your